Okay, this lesson we are going to be looking at another poem called My Last Duchess, written by the poet Robert Browning. Again, I recommend that you do this in 2 sessions, but it is up to you. This is all the work that you will be given for English for this week. So please take your time to do all the tasks in full and write your paragraphs at the end using the format that we practiced in class and putting in as much information as you can just to make this as worthwhile as possible. We are going to start with predictions. So again, if you could write today's date at the top of your page, the title is My Last Duchess. If you could underline that with a ruler, and the first thing to write down is predictions. So if you could write My Last Duchess in the middle of some lines, and then if you could annotate around that title and address those questions. So what does my imply about the speaker of the poem? What kind of word is my? What are the connotations of my? Look at the word last. It's ambiguous. It can have more than one meaning. What might those meanings be? And how might that change the way we think about this poem and what it might be about? And Duchess, what does it imply about the types of people that we're going to be meeting in this poem? So if you could spend 5 minutes doing that, that would be great. So a bit about Robert Browning. He was a Victorian poet, really heavily influenced by his father's art and book collection. So a really well-read, highly educated poet from a very young age. He was a massive fan of Percy Bysshe Shelley, who wrote Ozymandias. So he's very heavily influenced by the work of the Romantic poets. So the Romantic era comes just before the Victorian era. So the Victorian era is named the Victorian era because Queen Victoria is on the throne. It ranges from about 1837 to 1901, and that kind of fits in with the contextual stuff that we've been looking at for Sign of Four. So he's best known for his use of the dramatic monologue, which is a form of poetry. And again, if you look on your glossary, you can find out a little bit more about it, but we will be talking more about it later on in this lesson, where somebody is giving a speech to an intended listener. And through that, we learn more about the character, the speaker themselves. So My Last Duchess is an example of a dramatic monologue, and it also reflects Browning's love of history and European culture. So it's thought that this poem is based on a real-life Italian duke from the 16th century. It's published in 1842, so about 5 years after the start of the Victorian era. And the Victorians are really interested just generally in the Italian Renaissance and the way that greedy aristocracy, the people with lots of money and status, have abused their power. So the Italian Renaissance begins at the opening phase of a Renaissance period. It's a period of kind of great cultural change and achievement in Europe. It spanned from around about the 14th century to about 1600, and in Italy it peaked around the late 15th century. So the Renaissance itself, Renaissance literally translates to rebirth, and it's this idea that they go back to, that they rebirth, they start to become very interested in classical literature and the culture of classical life, so the Greeks and the Romans. And it's that whole Italian Renaissance period is best known for its cultural achievements, including works by Petrarch. So remember when we looked at Ozymandias, we looked at the Petrarchan sonnet. It was also famous for people like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. So a lot of art is produced during this Renaissance period. The poem is set, if it is based on this duke, it's set in Ferrara, which is a city in northeast Italy. And the duke is very egotistical and he is talking about his last Duchess, his wife that had died previous to when he is recalling this information. Now, in the poem, the Duke's name is never given. So just like Ozymandias, it could be kind of allegorical, this kind of power that the Duke has over his last Duchess kind of dies when she does. He doesn't continue to have power over her, although he thinks he does by the way he behaves with her portrait, and you will see that as we go into the poem. So the main points you need to know is Robert Browning is a Victorian poet. He's best known for the use of the dramatic monologue. He's influenced by the Romantic poets and looking at greed and how people abuse their power. And this may be based on a real life duke in Italy. So what is this poem about? Basically, we hear a duke describing the portrait of his late wife, and he's describing this to a count's emissary. Now, an emissary is like a person who's sent as a diplomatic representative. So he is the count's representative, and he is there to help arrange a marriage between the duke and the count's daughter. Now, what he's there essentially to do is to negotiate or agree on a dowry. Now, a dowry is something that a father would pay a prospective husband in order for them to marry their daughter. So it's quite an archaic thing. We don't have that so much these days, although in some cultures they still do. But he's there to negotiate. So how much is this woman worth? Now, in the course of talking about his late wife, the Duke unwittingly reveals his true character. So he says things about what happened and what his former Duchess was like. So we do learn some things about her, but mostly we kind of learn things about him and the kind of person that he is. And we suspect that he had her killed because he thought she might have been unfaithful. So again, we see this pride because maybe she's been unfaithful and that's somehow compromised his power or his reputation. He has her killed out of pride. So in some ways, this poem explores the power of relations in marriage, but also the link between power and pride. Okay, I'd like you to just listen to the poem being read in whole. Sorry if you get the advert before, but once the clip starts, if you want to make it quicker, skip to 44 seconds in, and that way you avoid the whole intro music. But it's really good to listen, just sit and listen to the whole poem being read through. Okay, we're going to go ahead and annotate this poem now. So what I've done is I've kind of tried to divide this poem into 3 sections. So the first section is the Duke allowing the emissary to see the portrait of his last Duchess. And the Duke enjoys wielding this power of having control over who is allowed to see her or not. Now remember I said to you this is a dramatic monologue. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about dramatic monologue before we start. Dramatic monologue is in 2 parts. So the dramatic part is because it reveals aspects of the speaker's character without that speaker really having the intention to reveal those things. So we learn something about the speaker. The monologue, mono meaning one person and log meaning speaking. So there is only one person speaking to an intended listener. Only one voice is heard. And that really suits this poem because the Duke is so arrogant, he only wants his voice heard. His is the only one worth listening to. He is in control. So the dramatic monologue really suits this poem. So starting with the title My Last Duchess, which is what your first task was, to look at those 3 words. So my, hopefully you recognize that is a possessive pronoun. It suggests that he wants to possess her like an object. Last, meaning the one before this coming one that he's negotiating over. And Duchess should signify that we are dealing with the aristocracy here, people with a lot of money and therefore a lot of power. So, Ferrara, being the Duke of Ferrara. That's My Last Duchess painted on the wall. Again, really important that you understand this idea of possession and this possessive pronoun, the my, being really important. Throughout this poem, you see that he talks about 2 other possessions, 2 other pieces of art. And that's really important because he treats her like a possession, like she was an object, a piece of art. So it's really important that you understand that use of possessive pronoun there. Looking as if she were alive. Again, it's important that she looks as if she was alive because he has control over her. Once she's dead, he loses that control. So by having a painting done that shows as if she were alive, in some way for him, helps him to carry on that power. I call that piece a wonder. Now, Fra Pandolf's hands. Now, Fra Pandolf is the name of a painter, and he was clearly a very famous artist of the time. So it suggests that he's kind of name dropping. It shows how important he is, how expensive that must have been. In a way, he's kind of boasting to the emissary. Worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you to sit and look at her? Even though it's a question, he really wants that emissary to sit and look at her. That will give him another opportunity to boast about his power. I said Fra Pandolf by design, so in case you missed it in the first place, I'm going to repeat the name of the artist, and that's important because he's kind of suggesting that the actual artist and the name of that artist and the fame that comes with that artist is more important to him than his last Duchess was, because he doesn't name his last Duchess, but he repeats the name of the artist twice. For never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, that the depth and passion of its earnest glance. So he's talking about strangers that he allows to look at this picture, and he talks about her in a positive way, like strangers that look at her would notice the positive things, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. Earnest meaning honest and open and serious glance. Okay, so he's quite positive. Strangers might find this a positive thing to see in her face. But, so that contrasting connective is important there because it signals a change. To myself they turn, so the people looking at this artist's portrait would look at it and then turn to him, and he says, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. Again, that show of power. I am letting you look at this portrait. I have the power over who looks at this portrait. And seems as they would ask me if they durst, so if they dare. So again, very much kind of like Ozymandias, you know, that idea of daring other people, people being too scared of him to dare to ask. How such a glance came there. Not so the first are you to turn and ask thus. Okay, so this idea that people would come and look at the painting, and if they would dare, if they weren't so scared of the Duke and the Duke's power, that they might dare to ask how that look of passion came to be in her face. Okay, so here that idea of passion being somehow maybe associated with sex. Okay, so we're going to look into that a little bit more in the second section. So in this second section, we learn about his last Duchess and what she was like. But even though he's describing what she's like, we actually learn more about the Duke. It says more about him than it does about her. Okay, so continuing on with the annotations. How such a glance came to be there. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus, Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. So here he's kind of saying that it wasn't only him, her husband, that made her happy, and this spot could be taken in two ways. So that idea of a spot of joy being like a mark of joy, something that you might notice, but it could also be that this spot of joy means it was only a tiny bit of joy, just a spot, not a lot of joy in her cheeks. So he's obviously feeling like maybe she's getting that joy from somebody else and not her husband's presence only. So here we start to get these hints that maybe he was jealous about the other things that could make her happy, and she wasn't just happy being his wife. So perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, again, a third time we see that artist's name repeated, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much. So the idea of too much suggests that there is something else going on. There's too much. That idea of something being too much means it's excessive. So again, a hint that maybe something isn't right. Or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flushed that dies along her throat. Now this is the first kind of clue that we get that perhaps he had her killed. So the idea that paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush. So the half flush might be the flush you would get either if you were blushing, or maybe after sex you might feel quite flushed. So again, that hint that maybe he's jealous, maybe he suspects that she's been unfaithful to him. And what is her punishment for being unfaithful to him or blushing, maybe being flattered by other men? That she dies along her throat. So that idea that maybe he had her throat cut, it creates a very sinister tone. They are words that are semantically linked to murder. So we get that first suspicion that is what's happened. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. So this idea that she would blush and become all flustered when people were nice to her, were kind to her, and she thought she was just doing a courtesy to them. But he saw that as something very different. He saw it as almost threatening his power and his reputation to be grateful to other people for things, that she should be happy enough just to be married to him. That should be enough for her to be happy. She had, I hear how you say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. So again, we see that too soon and that too easily impressed. So again, it hints that he didn't think it was right. He thought it was excessive. He's trying to be polite by using that rhetorical question. How can I say? It's a kind of interruption. He's trying to find the right words, but actually it's a kind of front that he's putting on, because actually he's trying to avoid coming across as just being really overtly jealous and showing his anger. So he's choosing his words carefully, because remember, he's talking to someone who's there to negotiate his next marriage. So he doesn't want to look like he's someone who's jealous and angry and could have her killed if she upsets him. So he's trying to choose his words carefully. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So again, this idea of her being too easily impressed, and she was happy looking at things. Lots of things made her happy, and he takes that again as being a threat to his power, a threat to his reputation and his name. Again, he doesn't believe that lots of things should make her happy. He believes that he alone should make her happy enough. She shouldn't have to look elsewhere. Search was all one. My favour at her breast, the drooping of the daylight in the west, the bough of the cherries, some officious fool broke into the orchard for her. So here he's kind of saying that my favour, so all the good things that I bring, exactly bring her the same amount of happiness as a sunset, so the drooping of daylight in the west. So a sunset made her happy. If some person took a bough from a cherry tree that would have been covered in blossoms and quite beautiful, that made her happy. So you can see all these things that actually maybe lots of people would find very endearing about the Duchess, he didn't like. He saw that in direct kind of competition with the happiness that he feels she should have had just being married to him. So the idea of the money and the material wealth that he could bring brought her the same level of joy as these very cheap and simple gifts. And that made him really angry. He wanted to be able to control her happiness, and control the things that made her happy and made her blush. And he couldn't control this. So that made him really unhappy. It kind of says about the Duchess that she was very grateful and gracious, but the Duke sees that as a flaw. And that's what I mean. It says more about him as a character than it does about her. What kind of person sees this as a character flaw, just to be gracious and grateful for the things that people were giving her? The white mule she rode around the terrace. A mule is significant because you would expect a duchess to be riding around on a very noble horse, a steed, something that looks really something that's to do with prestige. But a mule is a working animal and doesn't have the same prestige. And she decides to ride this mule, and it's white. So again, white, we have connotations with innocence. So, she's a very innocent character who doesn't really value all of this prestige and all this material goods, unlike him. All and each would draw from her alike the approving speech or blush at least. So she's really thankful and she's really grateful for all of these. She thanked men, good, but thanked somehow, I know not how. So this idea of she thanked men, which is nice, but good, that suggests, that exclamation suggests that she did more than just thank them. She did more than just blush. She thanked them good. So again, that exclamation mark shows his anger is starting to rise. He's kind of losing control. And again, that is due to his insecurity and perhaps his jealousy. So this is the final section, the last section, where we really see his abuse of power and his pride and his pomp in all the material things he has, as if there's some kind of symbol of his greatness. And those material things, those objects that he owns, include his wives. And particularly here we see his greed and his desire for money over having an actual wife. So we finished on this idea of her thanking men and thanking them good. And he says here, somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. This really shows his arrogance and his vanity. He just cannot understand how she can compare his gift of his name to anybody's gift, no matter how big or small. He just can't comprehend it. Like, he is and should be the most important thing, and not even him as a person, but his name and the status and the reputation and the power that comes with his name. As that says a lot about him and what he values in life. Now this next section, I'm just going to read quite a bit of it and then I'll go back and explain it. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one, and say just this or that, and you disgust me, here you miss, or there you exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. So all that bit there is basically saying she needed lessons on how to behave. She needed lessons on what she should and should not be thankful for, according to the Duke. It suggests that he has a certain set of standards, and that Duchess just didn't meet his standards. She just didn't understand how important he was and how grateful she should have been to him. And that actually disgusted him. So he's saying, in order to school her and teach her that way, I would actually have to lower myself to her level. That's that idea of stooping. I would have to bring myself to the point where I would have to point out these things, and I should never have to do that. A duchess who is worthy of all these things should be able to recognize that. So for him to correct that behavior in her would somehow be demeaning to him, and he chooses never to do that, never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. But who passed without much the same smile? Again, this kind of tone of disbelief. She smiled at me, which she absolutely should have to, no doubt. But she smiled the same smile to everybody. Things like maids and servants. And he saw that as being really wrong. That he should have been treated by her in a very different way. She should have been much more gracious and much more grateful to him than she should have been to anybody else. And what really angered him is this behavior in her, which a lot of people would see as positive, grew. So that use of that semicolon there, that use of caesura, that pause within the line, really gives that kind of sense of finality. Because it grew, he could no longer put up with it. He had to put an end to it. Now this next line is really chilling. I gave commands and all smiles stopped. So it's that idea of I gave the command. So I gave the command to have her killed. It's very sinister. And all smiles stopped is a euphemism. So a euphemism, that's a technical term when we use a word that makes something unpleasant seem less so. So to say all smiles stopped sounds better than saying have her killed, okay, or to kill her, or she died, okay, she was dead. So that really shows the kind of power he had over her. He had the kind of power that dictated whether she could live or if she died, okay. There she stands as if alive. Again, it's really important that she stands as if she's alive, because it's the only way he still has power over her. Her painting satisfies him as much as she did in real life. Essentially, she was a possession in real life. She is now a possession once she's dead, and almost a more important possession because she is painted by Frau Pandolf. So the idea that she's actually worth more dead as a portrait than she probably was alive. And it also gives the poem a kind of cyclical structure. It goes back to the idea of Frau Pandolf and that use of that phrase, as if alive. And that cyclical structure is important because you know that this will probably happen to his next Duchess if she too also doesn't recognize how important she is, if she decides, or if it's in her nature to be gracious and kind and thankful to other people, this will happen again. So that cyclical structure kind of represents that. Will it please you to rise? So he's had enough of talking about that now. He wants to move on to the next Duchess and talk about the negotiations. We'll meet the company below then. I repeat, the Count your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So he's saying, now the Count is known for his wealth and his generosity, and I know that that's guarantee enough that my ask for a big dowry will not be disallowed, because he prizes himself as being worthy of a big dowry. Now, a dowry was paid by the father to the person that they were going to marry, and in this case, what the father gets back for handing over this dowry and his daughter is the fact that his own status grows, because now his daughter is married to a duke. So that idea that it kind of is good for the Count, it's good for the Count's reputation, and he knows that his daughter financially is going to be well looked after. Though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Now that's a kind of, again, a play on words with the word object. It can mean object as in possession, or object as in my aim, the object of my affection. That idea is he's trying to say, well, I've told you at the beginning, my aim is his daughter, not his dowry, but actually we know that that's probably not true. Again, he's just trying to make himself look good, but it actually says a lot about him, the fact that he even uses that word object. And then finally, we go back to another piece of art. So as they go down together to meet the others to talk about this dowry, he points out another piece of artwork that he owns. So he says, notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse. So Neptune is the god of the sea, and he is taming a seahorse, a wild creature. And that's exactly how the Duke sees himself, as almost godlike, just like Ozymandias did when he said he was king of kings. This reference to Neptune suggests like the Duke sees himself as kind of godlike. And in some ways he is, because he has the power to take life. And he is taming a seahorse. So he tames his wives like Neptune tames a seahorse, so that they behave in the way that he wants them to behave. Thought a rarity which Claus of Innsbruck cast for me in bronze. So that idea that, again, he references another famous artist and another object, and again that helps to develop that circular structure of the poem. So we're going to look at form and structure of this poem. So the poem is a dramatic monologue. We've talked about that idea of the dramatic monologue being used as a form where it shows only one voice, only one perspective, and that suits the Duke very well because, according to him, he is the most important thing. So to have a dramatic monologue reflects that attitude of the Duke. Also, it is in first-person narrative, and that allows us to really understand his actions and his motivations, even when he doesn't really recognize that he's allowing us to see that, or maybe recognizing that that's a part of his own character. As readers, we do see it, and it's quite obvious to us. The descriptions of the Duchess reveal that she's really kind and gracious, and it makes us sympathetic to her. Because we're sympathetic to her, because we like her, we definitely do not like the Duke because he has her killed. The repetition shows that the Duke is preoccupied with certain ideas and behaviors. The idea of repeating Fra Pandolf, for example, shows that he is preoccupied with the idea of status and only having the best, and also bragging and making sure everybody else knows that he has the best, that he can afford the best. So all of those things. This idea of him being narcissistic, or his narcissism. Now, narcissism is like a personality disorder, and it's one of those disorders that is a mental condition in which people have this very inflated sense of their own importance. They have this deep need and desire for excessive attention and admiration. Everything has to be about them. That quite often leads to trouble in relationships because there is a lack of empathy for others. They don't consider other people. It's all about just them and them being recognized and appreciated. We see that through that use of possessive pronouns. So everything's about him. He becomes just an object. She becomes an object for him to control and to own. And everything she does is a reflection on him. So he doesn't think about the fact that she's kind and gracious and that makes other people happy. He only thinks about how that reflects upon him and him as her husband. So that word narcissism or narcissistic is a really good, ambitious, sophisticated word to use when talking about this poem. The other thing I want to quickly just cover is the rhyme scheme. So the poem is written in rhyming couplets, but because the lines aren't end-stopped, when you listen to it, it's less obvious than it might be. But when you see it on paper, it's quite easy to see. And this kind of not end-stopping the rhymes really pushes the poem on, and that can reflect the Duke's kind of relentless pursuit of his next bride. The other thing in terms of the strict use of rhyming couplets throughout, his speech is very highly structured. Control is very much part of his personality. So as he speaks, it's obvious to the reader that the Duke is choosing his words carefully. And because of this, he should be considered a very unreliable narrator. He only tells his part of the story, and we're quite suspicious of him. As the poem progresses, it becomes more obvious that he's kind of lost touch with reality and what normal people and how normal people would see his reaction. So that use of the very controlled rhyming couplets reflects the control that he wants and he had over his wife. So looking at the ideas, themes and issues that are explored in this poem, hopefully you can see that there are some similarities to Ozymandias in terms of power, control and pride. There's very similar themes to Ozymandias. So in terms of violence, power and control, the Duke has a total lack of remorse at having his wife murdered. In some ways, he's almost boasting about it by alluding to the fact that he gave the command before all smiles stopped. So he definitely doesn't regret it or have remorse about it. And that shows his use of violence and power because he is a Duke, because he has that place in society. People dare not question him, and people are prepared to not question him on it. He has absolute power over her. And that's not just because she's a woman, he's a man, and you would expect a woman to be subservient. It comes down to the fact that he has a position in society that places him above others. And in that sense, you can see where he's kind of inspired both by the Romantic movement and the Romantic values of that idea of challenging those people in positions of power and giving a voice to those common people, those people who are exploited and who are controlled and abused. So no one dare ask him about anything about the portrait. So he has to make up what he thinks their questions would be. And again, he doesn't even allow another voice into this poem. It's all about him. And so he's kind of preempting these questions, and he's very carefully choosing his words. So he has the power to tell the story. We never hear her side of the story. Again, that is a reflection of his power and the fact that she has absolutely no power. And therefore, he controls the narrative of their relationship. He's so obsessed with controlling his wife that he uses the power that he has to have her killed. And he doesn't regret it. There's no sense of mourning or loss. He is just thinking about the next wife and the next dowry. So that idea of power and control is very much linked to greed. And again, that is a romantic kind of idea that people with power and control is very much linked to money and greed. So the other thing is the jealousy and the pride. So the Duke was jealous of the attention that his wife gave to others, and he wanted to be the only person in her favor. So again, that narcissistic tendency that he had, he needed excessive admiration, and he didn't get that from her. So that made him jealous. And because he didn't get it from her, and because he just couldn't comprehend that she didn't value him enough, he has her killed. And he kind of justifies that to himself by suggesting that maybe she's been cheating on him, maybe her infidelity is alluded to. And again, that's just his way of justifying his actions. So he boasts about all of these beautiful objects that he owns, including the Duchess's portrait. So again, as I said before, she's almost worth more to him dead as a portrait than she was to him alive. But he's kind of unaware of the effect of his words. As a reader, we clearly see that he is jealous and overly proud. He has this hubris, this excessive pride. And if we're aware of it, then we're assuming the emissary is also aware of it. And so actually his pride and his jealousy might come back to actually bite him in the bottom. So he's proud of his name, and he just didn't really feel that the Duchess respected its value. And again, that just comes down to that excessive pride. He didn't feel that he was valued enough. So you can see that there are definite crossovers between Ozymandias and his pride and the Duke and his pride. So think about that idea of capturing their power in the form of art. So Ozymandias did it in the sense of a statue, and My Last Duchess, the Duke, does it in the form of a portrait. So the idea that they tried to capture their power and make their power last, even after, in Ozymandias' case, his own death, and in My Last Duchess's case, the death of his Duchess, he still tries to hold on to that power. Okay, I'd like you to watch this quickfire revision just to refresh your memories about the poems if you're doing this in 2 sessions, and then answer questions 1 to 10. After you've answered questions 1 to 10, if you move on to the next slides, you will see that I've given you the answers so you can check your answers. And then I would like you to do the extended writing task, the extended response. Write me 2 paragraphs and then send me the photo of your work so I can give you feedback to ensure that you've understood it. So watch this clip first and then have a go at answering the questions.